Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon so that you never miss any video lesson from RAU'S Study Circle. Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an analysis of the Hindu newspaper from UPSC perspective. Today we will discuss the daily edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 16 February 2021. And the articles that we will discuss today are displayed on your screen. So let us start the discussion. Now, this article on page number 6 has been written in the context of the likely foreign policy that Joe Biden, who is the new elected president of the United States of America, is likely to follow as far as the Israel-Palestine conflict is concerned. And in this line, the author argues that even though the new president Joe Biden is returning to the pre-Trump stance of supporting a two-state solution in principle for the Israel-Palestine conflict, the situation is not going to change much. In this line, he has highlighted the policy that was followed by Donald Trump regarding the Israel and the Palestine, and also the changes that have been brought by Joe Biden. And finally, he argues that the situation is going to remain the same, or there will be continuity and no change will be witnessed as far as the Biden's plan for the Palestine and the Israel conflict is concerned. So in this regard, in this article, let us try and understand the key aspects of the US policy on the Israel-Palestine conflict and especially its policy towards Israel. And some of the points that we discuss here can be important for us from General Studies Paper 2 point of view in the topic International Relations, and it will also help us in understanding what is happening in the West Asia currently. So what you need to understand here is that the dynamics in West Asia keep on changing continuously. And that is why the interests of various stakeholders are at stake in this particular region. In this, the policies are mainly concerned with the Israel-Palestine conflict, also the issues and the Cold War-like situation that exists between two important rivals of West Asia, that is the Saudi Arabia and Iran, and also what are India's interests in the West Asia, particularly regarding its energy and economic security. So in this regard, let us look at what is the likely change that can be witnessed under Joe Biden's presidency as far as the US foreign policy towards Israel and Palestine is concerned. Now, regarding Israel, you might be knowing that it was carved out of the Palestinian territory, which was under the control of colonial powers or the erstwhile colonial powers before the Second World War. And the state of Israel, which is a Jewish state, was carved out in the year 1948. And after its creation, Israel has continuously been in war with various Arab powers, and also it has tried to increase its influence in the remaining Palestinian territories of West Bank and Gaza. And accordingly, the Israel is increasing its settlements in the West Bank region, which is presently the Palestinian territory. However, the concern here is that Israel is pursuing an expansionist policy and is trying to capture the Palestinian territory. And in this regard, under the Donald Trump, the policy of the United States of America was that it supported the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's expansionist policies in the Palestinian territory and particularly in the West Bank region. In this regard, Trump had proposed that the 30% of the West Bank, which consists of Jordan Valley and the settlement blocks, should be annexed by Israel, which means he indirectly or directly supported the expansionist policies of the Israel that it is pursuing in the Palestinian territory of West Bank. Further, another strategic change that was done under Donald Trump was that he moved the American embassy from the capital of Israel, that is Tel Aviv, to Jerusalem, which is again another contested territory in the Israel and the Palestinian conflict. And also, the United States of America under Donald Trump had endorsed the Israeli annexation of the Syrian territory, which was occupied or captured by Israel in 1967, which is known as the Golan Heights. Further, Donald Trump had cut off the $360 million annual funding to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which deals with the Palestinian refugees. And he had shut down the Palestinian Liberation Organization's office, which was functioning in the Washington, D.C. So in short, the Donald Trump had supported the cause of Israel and did not accept the in-principle solution that was accepted by the previous presidents of the United States of America and which is known as the two-state solution. And this two-state solution provides for the creation of two countries or two states. First one is Israel and second one is Palestine. In this regard, under the new President Joe Biden, the policy of two-state solution has been accepted by him. And this was also the policy that was followed by the United States of America during the pre-Trump era. Further, Joe Biden has said that he will be resuming the United States of America's aid to the Palestinians. And also, Joe Biden has opposed the Israel's formal annexation of the one-third of the occupied territories in the West Bank region, which was earlier supported by the Donald Trump. However, on the aspect of the US Embassy in Israel, the new administration has said that the US Embassy in Israel would remain in the Jerusalem and would not be shifted again to Tel Aviv. So basically, this is a continuation of the stance that was taken under the Donald Trump administration, even under the Joe Biden administration. Now, why is the author skeptical that although Joe Biden is retreating to the pre-Trump policy that was followed by the United States of America towards Israel and Palestine, situation is not going to change, or there is likely to be a status quo in the situation as far as the Israel-Palestinian conflict is concerned. Let us look at these aspects. So in this regard, it has been said that the US administration has itself admitted that any solution in the near future is highly unlikely. And in this regard, the new Secretary of the State, Mr. Blinken, has accused the Palestinians of being responsible for the future of the negotiations. That is, the new Secretary of the State has made the Palestinians themselves responsible for getting towards any kind of solution. In this regard, it is highly accepted across the globe that the Palestinians are the victims of the Israeli expansionist policies, and these are the citizens who are termed as the stateless citizens because Palestine is still not a recognized state. In this regard, the author highlights that the American policy towards Israel and Palestine has been influenced by the Israeli propaganda. And the Israeli propaganda has been accepted in the American policy circles because of the influence of the Israeli lobby in the US Congress, and also the presence of various important personalities who have sympathies with Israel in key positions in the successive administrations of the United States of America. Further, as far as the Middle East is concerned, the US considers Israel to be its stable ally in the region, which is seen as the most turbulent regions in the world because of the various contestations that are going on between Israel and the Arabic countries, and also within the Saudi Arabia-led and the Iran-led countries, which is being seen as a Cold War that is at play in the West Asian region. And regarding the resumption of Iran nuclear deal under Joe Biden, the author is skeptical that Israel has opposed the US from returning to the Iran nuclear deal again. And you might be knowing that the United States of America had withdrawn from this Iran nuclear deal under the Donald Trump administration. Now, here it is important to highlight that the Israel-Palestine issue is a historical one. And accordingly, you can find references regarding the Israel-Palestinian issue and the details of this conflict in the World History book by Norman Lowe. However, a brief description of the creation of Israeli state and the conflict that is going on since the creation of Israel has been discussed in the DNS of 30th June 2020. Further, Israel was in news in last year with regards to the Abraham Accords that were signed between Israel and UAE and Bahrain. And they have also been discussed extensively in the previous DNS videos, and you will get a brief analysis of the Abraham Accords in the DNS dated 14th October 2020. So do go through these videos and try and get an analysis of the previous existing issues related to Israel. And going back to these DNS videos will also be helpful for those students who do not have much idea about the current affairs or the happenings that have taken place in the last year. Now, to search the previous DNS videos, you can simply type RAU'S in the search box on YouTube and type the date for the DNS for which you are looking. For example, if you are searching for the DNS of 14th October 2020, just type 14-10-2020. And if you then click on the search button, you will see the Daily News Simplified of 14th October 2020. So accordingly, you can look for the previous DNS videos whose reference is being made in the present DNS videos. Now, with regards to West Asia, one of the important things from the prelims examination point of view is the map location of West Asia. And various important strategic locations that are in news have been asked previously in the prelims examinations. And we have already discussed about important locations and the geographical locations in the West Asian region in a previous DNS video. So in this video, we will be revising from that video the important locations in the West Asia from our preliminary examination perspective. Now this data point on page number 11 is related to the encroachments of Israel in the West Bank territory of Palestine. And this highlights that the government-backed Israeli settlements in the West Bank in Palestine have been increasing since the 1967 war. Now, Israel-Palestine conflict has been continuing after the Second World War, and this has been one of the most important conflicts in the Middle Eastern region or in the West Asian region. Now, to understand the Israel-Palestine conflict, you can go through the world history book, that is Norman Lowe. However, in this article, we will try and understand the various geographical aspects of this conflict and why are some of the locations important for us from exam point of view. So we shall look at it from the preliminary examination point of view. For example, we will look at the location of West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, etc. And many a times questions have been asked based on these locations. Now this Israeli encroachment in the Palestine region has also been in news because the US has recently announced that such encroachments by Israel will not be considered by the US as illegal. However, you should note that the United Nations and the European Union, etc., have termed these encroachments by the Israel in the Palestinian region as illegal. So this shows that the United States of America has recently changed its policy towards Israel. And that is why it has been in news in the past week or two. Now, if you look at the previous year preliminary examination question papers, you will find that questions have been asked in the preliminary examination related to various conflict zones. So, for example, this question was asked in the year 2018 in the preliminary examination. And it reads, the term two-state solution is sometimes mentioned in the news in the context of the affairs of. So this two-state solution has been in the news in the context of the Israel and the Palestinian conflict. Secondly, you should note that this question was asked in the year 2015 and it reads, the area known as Golan Heights sometimes appears in the news in the context of. So this again is from this region and that is why it was asked in the year 2015. And that is because this region is continuously in news because of this Israel-Palestinian conflict. Further, these two similar looking questions were asked in different years by UPSC. For example, this question was asked in the year 2015 and this question was again asked in the year 2017. And the question reads that which one of the following countries of Southwest Asia does not open out into the Mediterranean Sea? So these two questions were related to the countries which have their border with the Mediterranean Sea. And this question is also taken from this conflict zone, that is the Israel-Palestinian conflict zone. And if you look at this question that was asked in the preliminary examination of 2018, it is again related to important locations which were in news, and all these locations were in the news because of various conflicts that are going on in these regions. So that is why such news articles which are related to various conflict zones are extremely important for us from the preliminary examination point of view. So in this context, let us understand the various important locations in the Israel and the Palestinian region. Now, if you look at this map, this shows the territory of Israel and the Palestine. So the territories which are under the control of Palestine are the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And this data point that is in the news article highlights that the Israel has been creating or constructing encroachments in this West Bank region. So these locations, that is the West Bank and the location of Gaza Strip, are important for us from exam point of view. And in this line, you should note that the Gaza Strip shares its border with the Mediterranean Sea. Then there is another region which is known as Golan Heights, which is continuously in news. And this Golan Height is also an Israeli occupied territory. And Israel occupied this territory in 1981. Now regarding its location, you should note that the Golan Heights has its border with countries like Lebanon, Israel, Jordan and Syria. So this can be a potential question in the exam as to which all nations share their border with the Golan Heights region continuously in news. Further, regarding the West Bank, you should note that it shares its border with Jordan. Also, the Dead Sea has its border with the West Bank. Further, Dead Sea has its border with Israel and Jordan. This can also be one of the important facts for us from preliminary examination. So all these locations are important, and as we know that previously many questions have been asked based on these. Especially there was a question related to Golan Heights in the year 2015. So similarly, all these other locations can also become important for us from preliminary examination point of view. So after this, let us look at which all countries share their border with Mediterranean Sea and on which questions have been asked previously. So regarding the countries that border the Mediterranean Sea, you should note that this question was asked in the year 2017 and it reads, the Mediterranean Sea is the border of which of the following countries? So the countries given are Jordan, Iraq, Lebanon and Syria. So as you can see in this map, the countries that share their border with Mediterranean Sea are the Lebanon, then there is Israel, then there is Syria and also Turkey. And besides these countries, many other countries are sharing their border with the Mediterranean Sea. So as you can see in this question, you could have easily eliminated that Jordan and Iraq do not share their border with Mediterranean Sea. And hence the correct answer would have been C, that is 3 and 4. That is Lebanon and Syria have their border with Mediterranean Sea. So similarly, you should note the location of different countries that share their border with the Mediterranean Sea. For example, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Spain, Italy, etc. So in this article, we have seen some of the important locations in the Middle Eastern region, which are important for us from preliminary examination point of view. And with this, let's take up the next article. Now, this article on page number 7 has been written in the context of the recently cancelled 2019 agreement between India and Japan and Sri Lanka that aimed to jointly develop the strategic East Container Terminal at Colombo in Sri Lanka. Now, India along with Japan was trying to develop this strategic East Container Terminal in Colombo in order to counter the increasing presence of China in the Indian Ocean region and especially in Sri Lanka with its development of the Hambantota port. However, this agreement for the development of East Container Terminal has now been cancelled by Sri Lanka. And accordingly, a lot of discussion is going on about the India-Sri Lanka ties in the backdrop of the cancellation of this agreement. Now, in this regard, India had unilaterally cancelled or terminated the India-Sri Lanka Bilateral Investment Treaty, which secures the foreign investments into a country. And accordingly, the Indian investors cannot take recourse to the legal aspects that were finalized under the Bilateral Investment Treaty because this agreement for the development of the East Container Terminal was finalized in the year 2019. And in this context, it becomes important for us to understand what is the Bilateral Investment Treaty, what are its key aspects, and why did India cancel these bilateral investment treaties unilaterally. And also, we will look at some of the aspects of the new model bilateral investment treaty that has been floated by Government of India and some of the concerns regarding this BIT. And the points that we discuss here can be important for us from the General Studies Paper 3 point of view in the topic Economy, and also some of the points can be used in answering the questions in General Studies Paper 2 in the topic International Relations. So the first question that comes into our mind is, what is bilateral investment treaty? So simply, these treaties are agreements that are signed between two countries for reciprocal promotion and protection of the investments in each other's territories by individuals and companies situated in either state. So for example, if the Indian investors are investing in Sri Lanka, their investments will be protected under this bilateral investment treaty if India has a BIT with Sri Lanka. Now, what happens is that such bilateral investment treaties encourage foreign investors to invest in a state. And as such, it contributes towards overall development and advancement of its economy. Now, some of the important features of a bilateral investment treaty include fair and equitable treatment, full protection and security, national treatment, MFN, expropriation, repatriation of investment returns, and investor-state dispute resolution. Now, in this regard, the fair and equitable treatment mandates the states to have a stable and predictable legal framework. And also, it should have a predictable legal framework for regulating investments which meets the reasonable expectations of the investors. Second clause of full protection and security mandates the states to provide full protection and safety to the foreign investments. Thirdly, under the national treatment, the foreign investors should be treated at par with the domestic investors. And as far as the most favored nation treatment is concerned, concessions that are extended to foreign investors of a particular country would be extended to foreign investors of other countries. That is, there will be no discrimination between investors from different countries. Further, under the expropriation or taking over of property, it bars the states or the countries from expropriating or taking over the property of the foreign investments except under the exceptional circumstances. That is, the states cannot unilaterally take over the property of investments by the foreign investors. Further, the repatriation of investments and returns mandates that the states should provide unrestricted power to the foreign investors to repatriate their investments and returns. That is, they can send back the interests or the profits that they earn by their investments to the home country. And finally, there is the clause of Investor State Dispute Resolution or the ISDS. And under this, the foreign investors can directly initiate arbitration proceedings against a state without even approaching its own government. That is, they can initiate the arbitration proceedings on their own. And in order to handle such a dispute, an ad hoc tribunal may be set up in accordance with the arbitration rules of the UN Commission on the International Trade Law. However, back in 2016, the Indian government decided to unilaterally terminate the bilateral investment treaties with more than 60 countries. And it was under this decision of the government of India that India had cancelled the bilateral investment treaty with Sri Lanka also. Now, the reasons that were cited by the government of India for the termination of the bilateral investment treaties were that these bilateral investment treaties that were signed by India gave extensive protection to the foreign investment with minimum regards for the state's interest based on the neoliberal model. That is, based on such bilateral investment treaties, foreign investments into India were being given more protection and the interest of India itself was not being taken care of. Now, for example, a number of foreign corporations had slapped the ISDS or the Investor State Dispute Resolution notices against India, challenging a wide array of regulatory measures such as imposition of retrospective laws, cancellation of spectrum licenses, and revocation of telecom licenses. And one of the biggest example of imposition of retrospective taxes was the Vodafone case. And these ISDS or the Investor State Dispute Resolution cases against India led to a fundamental rethinking in the Indian government and reviewing of such bilateral investment treaties in India. And this led to the adoption of Model Bilateral Investment Treaty back in 2016. So in this regard, let us look at the key provisions of the Model BIT and how it aims at countering the issues with the existing bilateral investment treaties. Now, under the Model Bilateral Investment Treaty that was floated by the Government of India in 2016, the new definition that has been adopted by this Model BIT is Enterprise-Based Definition of Investment. And under this, the asset-based definition of investment under the earlier BITs has now been replaced by this new enterprise-based definition under the Model BIT. Now, this asset-based definition considers every kind of assets, both movable and immovable assets, including the intellectual property rights as investments, and gives them protection under the treaties. However, by moving away from such an asset-based approach to an enterprise-based approach, India aims at narrowing the scope of investments to be protected and thus seeks to reduce the number of BIT claims that can be brought against India, as was the case in the famous Vodafone case. Second important clause of the Model BIT is the exclusion of most favored nation treatment. And in recent years, some foreign investors had sued India, arguing that they have to get the same beneficial treatment given to the companies from other countries. And accordingly, India dropped this MFN clause, which led to a lot of arbitration notices being issued against India based on the past or the previous BITs. Third interesting aspect of the BIT is the conditions for initiating arbitrations at the international arbitrations. Now, in this regard, the new model's BIT stipulates that an aggrieved investor should first use all the local remedies as well as negotiations and consultations before initiating arbitrations against the host state. And investors can use outside remedies only 5 years after resorting to all domestic arrangements. So, a clear process has been laid down by the model BIT as far as the issue of international arbitrations of the foreign investments is concerned. And finally, the model BIT lays down the rule of corporate social responsibility. That is, it mandates the foreign investors to voluntarily adopt internationally recognized standards of corporate social responsibility. Now, the concern that is being raised with respect to such model BITs is that the unilateral termination of the bilateral investment treaties by India has led to decrease in FDI inflows into India. And apart from that, such treaties work on reciprocal basis as we have learned initially, and accordingly the Indian investors in other countries do not have the option of suing the foreign governments, and that is exactly the point that has been argued by the author in this particular article regarding the interest of the Indian investors in the Sri Lanka regarding the agreement related to the development of East Container Terminal. So let us look at the points that have been highlighted by the author regarding the interest that was shown by the Indian investors in the development of the East Container Terminal under the agreement. So as we all know that recently Sri Lanka cancelled this 2019 agreement with India and Japan that aimed to jointly develop the strategic East Container Terminal at Colombo. Now, the author argues that although actual investments were not done by the Indian investors in Sri Lanka, however, they had made up their mind for their investments. So, in this regard, the author says that an important component of the fair and equitable treatment provision is that the host state should protect the legitimate expectations of the foreign investors. And in a previous arbitration case, it was held that the concept of legitimate expectations, which has been provided under the Fair and Equitable Treatment Clause, relates to a situation where the host state's conduct creates reasonable and justifiable expectations. And Sri Lanka, by signing the agreement with India and Japan to jointly develop the East Container Terminal at Colombo, had created such expectations on the part of Indian investors. And defaulting on this agreement without specific and reasonable justification potentially violates the Indian investors' legitimate expectations and also the fair and equitable treatment provision of the Bilateral Investment Treaty. However, issue here is that India had unilaterally terminated the India-Sri Lanka BIT on March 22, 2017 in pursuance of its policy of 2016. And this termination was a part of the termination of other BITs that India undertook in 2017 as a result of several ISDS claims that were being brought against India. Now, although India has unilaterally cancelled the bilateral investment clause, there is a survival clause. And under the Article 15.2 of the India-Sri Lanka BIT, it contains a clause, and according to which, in case of a unilateral termination of the treaty shall still continue to be effective for a further period of 15 years from the date of its termination in respect of all those investments made or acquired before the date of termination. That is, all the investments that were done before 22nd March 2017, that is the date of cancellation of the Bilateral Investment Treaty, will enjoy or will continue to enjoy treaty protection. That is, will continue to enjoy protection under the Bilateral Investment Treaty. However, in the case of investment in developing the East Container Terminal, this survival clause will not be applicable because this agreement was signed in 2019 after the India had cancelled the Bilateral Investment Treaty. And as such, the Indian investors will not be able to sue the Sri Lankan government before an ISDS or the Dispute Settlement Tribunal, even though they could have easily sued the Sri Lankan government under the Bilateral Investment Treaty that existed between India and Sri Lanka previously. So in this regard, the author says that India needs to understand that the bilateral investment treaties do not empower merely the foreign investors to sue India, but it also authorizes Indian investors to make the use of bilateral investment treaties to safeguard their investments in turbulent foreign markets, as has been highlighted in the case of cancellation of the agreement of East Container Terminal development. And as India is now emerging as an exporter and not just an importer of capital, the government should revisit its stand on the bilateral investment treaties, which will help the future investments by the Indians in other foreign countries. So these are few important points that have been highlighted by this article, and we have also learned about some of the issues related to bilateral investment treaties in this regard. With this, let's take up the next news article now. Now, this article on page number 9 reads that the geospatial data policy has now been liberalized. And in this regard, the Ministry of Science and Technology has released new guidelines for the geospatial sector in India. And it has deregulated the existing protocol and has liberalized the sector to a more competitive field. In this regard, it is important for us to know what is geospatial data, what is the present policy on the geospatial data, and why has the government now deregulated this geospatial data, and what are the key features of this liberalized policy and how it is going to have an impact in India. Now, the points that we discuss here can be important for us from the General Studies Paper 3 point of view, both in economic development under innovations and also in the technology part, where we can see the impact or the use of science, and a policy related to important science and technology decision has been liberalized. And that is why in both these topics a question can be asked. So let us start with first, what is geospatial data in the first place? Now, geospatial data is simply the data about objects, events, phenomena that have a location on the surface of Earth. This is particularly a very important aspect, that such kind of objects, events or phenomena can be related to a location on the surface of the Earth. Now, this kind of location may be static or dynamic. Now, static information, for example, can include the location of a road, location of an earthquake event, malnutrition among children, and the dynamic information can include a moving vehicle or pedestrian or the spread of an infectious disease. For example, we have witnessed the spread of COVID-19. So, for example, on your screen, you can see the geo-tagging that has been done regarding the spread of COVID-19 cases in India in different states and also in different parts of the world in the neighboring countries of India. So, this is an example of geospatial data related to the spread of infectious disease of COVID-19. So, this geospatial data simply combines the location information, attribute information, and temporal information, or the time at which the location and the attributes exist. So basically, it provides information related to the location and the event that has taken place. For example, if you are geotagging or getting geospatial data about a road, this attribute here will be road. And in case of events like earthquakes or the spread of COVID-19 disease, this attributed information will be different. And also it will have a temporal information, that is, for how much time did this event or attribute exist. Further, this geospatial data usually involves information of public interest, for example, roads, localities, rail lines, water bodies, and public amenities. And the past decade has seen an increase in the use of geospatial data in daily life. For example, various food delivery apps are also using the geospatial data, like Swiggy, Zomato, e-commerce websites like Amazon and Flipkart, and even the weather applications are now using the geospatial data for providing you the weather updates and predictions for the coming days. So now, what is the present policy of government on the geospatial data? Now, under the present policy, there are strict restrictions on collection, storage, use, sale, dissemination of the geospatial data and mapping. And this policy has not been renewed in decades. And this has been because of internal as well as external security concerns for the Indian government. And presently, the sector was dominated by the Indian government as well as the government-run agencies, for example, the Survey of India. And if the private companies required to access this geospatial data, they had to go through a system of permissions from different departments of the government as well as the defense and the home ministries in order to be able to collect, create or disseminate the geospatial data. That is, the process was a very difficult and a very long and time consuming process. And initially, this geospatial data collection was concerned with security, and accordingly, it was the prerogative of the defense forces and the government only. And private sector was not allowed to carry, create, or collect or disseminate this data. However, under its new policy, the government has now deregulated this geospatial data. So let us look at the aspects of the new policy and how it is going to be helpful. Now, the problem with the existing policy was that the process of acquiring licenses and the permission involved a lot of red tape. And under such a system, the permission could take months and there could be delaying of the projects. And this was a problematic aspect for Indian companies as well as for the government agencies which needed to access the data had to go through a long procedure of permissions. And as such, the deregulation eliminates the requirement of permissions as well as scrutiny, even for the security concerns. And now, the Indian companies will be able to self attest, conforming to the government guidelines without actually having to be monitored by a government agency. And as such, these guidelines place a great deal of trust in Indian entities. Besides this, there is also a huge lack of data in the country, and this has impeded or restricted the planning for infrastructure, development, and businesses which are data based. And also the mapping of entire country of India, and that too with high accuracy by the Indian government, would have taken decades. And as such, the entry of private sector has now been provided for, and the government therefore felt an urgent need to incentivize the geospatial sector for Indian companies and increased investments from private players in this particular sector. Now, initially, when the collection of geospatial data was started, it was done with regards to the security purposes for India. However, of late, the geospatial data has now become imperative for government in planning for different social sectors, for example, infrastructure, development, social development, natural calamity, etc. And as such, the government is in dire need of increased geospatial data for effective application or implementation of its policies related to social sector, infrastructure development, and other important economic decisions. Now, in this regard, you might have heard about a term known as geotagging, and this is also the process of ascertaining the geographical location of an image. And this geotagging is the process of adding additional geographical information like latitude and longitude to various media such as photo or video. And the government of India is using this geotagging for various flagship schemes like the Mahatma Gandhi Narega and especially for the works that are being done under Narega. And in the implementation of Narega, the government is using the technology of geotagging, which also helps in collecting the geospatial data related to the implementation of that particular policy. Also, such kind of technologies are being used in Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, etc. Further, besides the government requiring such kind of data and the interest of private sector in such data, there has been a global push for the open access to the geospatial data. And that is because such kind of data is considered to be affecting the lives of ordinary citizens. And as such, the new guidelines have ensured such an open access with the exception of sensitive defense or security related data. That is, except the defense or security related data, the geospatial data will now be available in an open access manner. Further, already large amount of geospatial data is available on global platforms, and as such, it was becoming difficult for the government of India to regulate such kind of data. So in this regard, let us try and understand what could be the likely impact of having such a liberal policy related to the geospatial data. So by liberalizing the system, the government will now ensure that more number of players are there in this field. Also, there is competitiveness of the Indian companies in the global market, and more accurate data that will be available to both government will help it in formulating plans and administrating and also help individual Indians. Further, startups and businesses can now use this data in setting up their concerns, especially in the sector of e-commerce or geospatial based apps. And this can likely increase the employment opportunities in these sectors in India. And Indian companies will now be able to develop indigenous apps. For example, the Indian companies will now be able to develop an Indian version of Google Maps. And also, there is likely to be an increase in the public private sectors with opening up of this sector and various companies working with the Indian government on various sectoral projects. Also, the government expects that there will be an increase in the investment in the geospatial sector by the companies, and also there will be an increase in the export of data to the foreign companies and countries, which is likely to boost the Indian economy. So, in this, we have learnt about the basics of geospatial data, what are the key highlights of the new policy and why was it required, and also we have seen the likely benefits of pursuing such a liberal policy on the geospatial data. With this, let's take up the next news article now. Now, this article on page number 10 reads that the leatherback turtle's nesting sites could be overrun by Andaman's development project. So, in this regard, this article relates to the classic case of development versus environmental conservation. And in this regard, we will look at some of the important aspects for us from the preliminary examination point of view under the topic environment and ecology. In this, first we will look at the key facts related to leatherback turtle, and after that we will look at the key aspects of the Andaman development project and some important locations in the Andamans and Nicobar from our preliminary examination perspective. So now first, regarding the species that is under threat because of the development activities in the Andaman Nicobar Island, the name of this species is giant leatherback turtle. So in this regard, let us look at its physiology, its status, that is the conservation status, distribution and the diet on which it relies. And these are particularly the aspects on which UPSC has been asking questions in the previous years related to various species. So regarding the giant leatherbacks, they rely on a unique suite of adaptations, and these include their large body size, changes in activity, metabolic rate, and peripheral insulation because of the fat, and also adjustments in blood flow to maintain stable core body temperatures in varying water temperatures from temperate to tropical latitudes. And that is why their distribution is circumglobal in nature, that is, they are not restricted to any particular geographical location. Further, these leatherback turtles dive much deeper as compared to other turtles, and they can reach up to a depth of about 1000 meter in the sea. Also, these are the largest of the 7 species of the sea turtles that are there on the planet. And these leatherback turtles are found in all oceans except for the Arctic and the Antarctic oceans. Regarding the status, they are listed as vulnerable under the IUCN's Red List. And in India's Wildlife Protection Act that was formulated in 1972, they have been listed in the Schedule 1. That is, they have been accorded the highest legal protection which is available to tigers in India. Regarding their distribution, they are found circumglobally except of course the Arctic and the Antarctic. However, their nesting areas are only present in the tropical waters. That is, they reproduce only in the tropical waters. However, the non-nesting range extends to subpolar regions, and within the Indian Ocean region, they nest only in Indonesia, Sri Lanka and the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, and that is why their conservation becomes an unique imperative for India. Further, regarding diet, for all their life stages, they rely on the zooplanktons, that is jellies and jelly-like organisms. So these are few important facts related to our preliminary examination related to giant leatherback turtle. Now after this, let us also look at some of the concerns and the development plan that is being executed in Andaman Nicobar Island that is threatening the leatherback turtle's habitat. So the concern here is that at least 3 key nesting beaches, which include 2 on Little Andaman Island and 1 on Great Nicobar Island, are under threat due to mega development plans that have been announced in the recent months related to these particular islands. And one of the contentious plan is that of Niti Aayog for development of a mega shipment port at the Galathea Bay on Great Nicobar Island. Now you can see the location of Little Andaman in this map here. And also you can look at the locations of important channels which have been asked previously in the prelims examination. For example, the 10-degree channel divides the Andaman and the Nicobar group of islands. Then there is Duncan Passage, then there is Coco Channel. Now regarding the development plan that is being executed on the Little Andaman Island, it proposes phased growth of tourism on this island. And it aims at de-reservation of over 200 square kilometer of pristine rainforest and also the reservation of about 140 square kilometer of the Onge Tribal Reserve. And you might be knowing that Andaman is home to some of the important PVTGs in India. And the two important sites where this development plan is being executed are both leatherback nesting sites, and these include the South Bay and the West Bay on this little Andaman island. Further, on the Great Nicobar Island, large number of nesting of leatherback turtles has been recorded, and it has mainly been recorded on the wide beaches at the mouth of Dagmar and Alexandria rivers on the west coast and at the mouth of Galathia River along its southeastern coast. So you can look at the location of the Galathia Bay National Park that is located on the Great Nicobar Island, and this is also a very important information for us from the preliminary examination point of view. And as far as the rescue plan for the leatherback turtles is concerned, the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change has released the National Marine Turtle Action Plan. And all the important sea turtle nesting habitats have been declared as important coastal and marine biodiversity areas, and they have been included in the Coastal Regulation Zone 1, which has been provided with the highest level of security. However, at the same time, the Government of India is pursuing its developmental plans in these coastal regulation zones, which are in clear violation of their own rules. So besides looking at the Galathia Bay National Park, you should also be aware of the other national parks that are located in the Andaman and Nicobar group of islands, and they include the Vandoor or the Mahatma Gandhi Marine National Park, the Middle Button Island National Park, Mount Harriet, North Button Rani Jhansi Marine National Park, Saddle Peak, South Button Island, Campbell Bay National Park, etc. And in the prelims compass of environment and ecology, you can always find the locations of important national parks of India that have been mentioned there. So do go through them. With this, let's take up the next news article now. Now, this article on page number 6 is related to the farm laws and taxation of the farmers, and it talks about a concept known as producer support estimate, about which Baswa sir has already discussed in the DNS of 22nd January 2021. So do go through this DNS analysis and try and understand the important aspects related to producer support estimates and negative producer support estimates in India and its implications, and also some of the suggestive strategies that have been provided. Further, this article on page number 13 talks about the disengagement process that has started between India and China along the line of actual control. And it gives us an account of how the clashes started and what is the current situation. In this regard, in the DNS of 29 January 2021, we have discussed about the strategy that has been provided by the external affairs ministers regarding dealing with China or China ties with India. And regarding the various issues related to the clashes along the line of actual control, you can always go through the Focus magazine of July 2020, where the details have been discussed. And this issue has been building up slowly, and as such it has been covered in the DNS videos of various months. But it is suggested that you should go through the video of 29 January 2021 where this disengagement process has been discussed, and also the strategy that has been highlighted by the external affairs ministers regarding India-China ties has also been discussed. With this, we conclude today's discussion. Now let's take up the question for the day.